The world on the edge. By the beginning of 1945, the outcome of World War II was no longer in doubt, but the war itself was becoming more destructive and desperate than ever before. Germany found itself trapped between two overwhelming fronts. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced rapidly after pushing through Eastern Europe, moving closer to the borders of the Third Reich. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces, following the success of the Normandy landings, steadily crossed France and approached the Rhine River. German cities were already devastated. Continuous strategic bombing had crippled industry, destroyed transportation networks, and left much of the country struggling to function. Factories slowed or stopped production, fuel shortages became severe, and supply lines collapsed under constant pressure. Despite the worsening situation, German leadership continued to demand total resistance, insisting victory was still possible if the nation endured long enough. On the Eastern Front, the Vistula-Oder offensive marked one of the fastest advances of the war. Soviet forces moved hundreds of kilometers within weeks, overwhelming exhausted German defenses and opening a direct path toward Berlin. The German army could no longer stabilize its lines, manpower shortages and declining equipment made coordinated defense increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, Allied armies in the west crossed into German territory. After the failure of Germany's final major offensive in the Ardennes, it became clear that the strategic initiative had permanently shifted. Germany was no longer capable of launching large-scale attacks, only delaying defeat. The world understood that the end was approaching, yet no one knew how many lives would still be lost before the fighting stopped. As victory drew closer for the Allies, resistance hardened. The war was entering its final phase, a moment when empires collapsed and the future global order began to take shape. The fall of Berlin. In April 1945, the war in Europe reached its final and most dramatic stage, the Battle of Berlin. Soviet forces launched a massive offensive toward the German capital, surrounding the city with overwhelming numbers of troops, artillery, and armored units. Berlin, once the political and symbolic center of Nazi power, became the last battlefield of the collapsing Reich. The city was already heavily damaged by years of bombing, but the fighting transformed it into ruins. Street by street, block by block, Soviet soldiers advanced through intense urban combat. Defensive positions were created inside buildings, subway tunnels, and barricaded streets. German forces, made up of remaining army units, militia formations, and hastily organized defenders, attempted to slow the advance despite impossible odds. Inside underground command bunkers, German leadership faced the reality that defeat could no longer be avoided. Communication lines were breaking down, military reports grew increasingly desperate, and entire formations ceased to exist as organized forces. The front lines moved closer to the center of the city each day. Civilians remained trapped in the chaos. Millions sheltered in basements while artillery fire and explosions echoed continuously across Berlin. Infrastructure collapsed, food supplies disappeared, and normal life ceased entirely. The battle became not only a military confrontation but also a symbol of the total destruction brought by years of war. By late April, Soviet troops reached the government district. Fighting intensified around key buildings as resistance gradually collapsed. The fall of Berlin represented more than the capture of a city, it marked the end of Nazi Germany. Germany surrenders, the end of war in Europe. By early May 1945, organized resistance inside Germany was collapsing everywhere at once. Berlin had fallen, communication between remaining military commands was breaking down, and millions of soldiers found themselves isolated without clear orders. Entire formations surrendered or retreated westward as the reality of defeat became undeniable. German leadership no longer controlled events. Military commanders across Europe began negotiating local ceasefires to prevent further destruction. Cities that had expected prolonged fighting instead witnessed sudden silence as weapons were lowered and front lines dissolved. The war that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years was ending not with a single decisive battle, but through the gradual disintegration of an exhausted state. On May 7, 1945, representatives of the German High Command signed an unconditional surrender agreement at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The document confirmed what was already clear on the battlefield: Germany's armed forces would cease all military operations. A second formal signing followed in Berlin on May 8, marking the official end of the war in Europe. Across the continent, reactions were immediate and emotional. In London, Paris, and many other cities, crowds gathered in the streets celebrating peace after years of fear and sacrifice. Church bells rang, flags appeared in windows, and strangers embraced in public squares. Yet alongside relief came awareness of immense loss. Entire regions lay in ruins, and millions were displaced. Victory did not instantly restore normal life. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and uncertain era. The war in Europe had ended, but its consequences would shape the world for generations. The war truly ends, 1945, and a new world begins. Although the war in Europe ended in May 1945, World War II was not yet over. Fighting continued across the Pacific, where Japan remained determined to resist despite devastating losses. Allied forces advanced steadily toward the Japanese mainland, facing fierce resistance that suggested a final invasion would come at an enormous human cost. Military planners expected that such an invasion could result in millions of casualties. Japanese cities were already suffering from intense aerial bombing, industry was collapsing, and shortages affected both civilians and the military. Yet surrender remained uncertain, and the conflict showed no immediate sign of ending. In August 1945, the war entered its final and most controversial phase. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, introducing a new and terrifying form of warfare. Within days, the scale of destruction became undeniable. Combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, this pressure led Japanese leadership to announce its decision to surrender. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri, officially ending World War II. For the first time in 6 years, global conflict ceased. Soldiers began returning home, prisoners were liberated, and nations faced the immense task of rebuilding shattered societies. The end of the war did not restore the old world, it created a new one. Empires weakened, new superpowers emerged, and international institutions were formed to prevent another global catastrophe. World War II ended in 1945, but its consequences defined the modern age.